Every generation carries an idea of what a strong or healthy human body is supposed to look like. Yet, what is interesting is how dramatically those expectations change, even though the biology of the human body does not change very much at all. You can see this clearly if you look at something as simple as popular culture. So, let's take Batman as an example. If you watch the television series from the 1960s, the version played by Adam West looks strong enough. But by modern standards, he simply looks like a normal adult man wearing a costume. The suit itself was essentially fabric, it didn't exaggerate muscle definition, and the character was not presented as an extreme physical specimen. In many ways, that version of Batman resembled the average man much more closely than modern portrayals do. Fast forward several decades, and the visual expectation changes dramatically. Modern portrayals of Batman are built around actors who train intensely to add muscle mass before filming, and the costume itself evolved from a cloth outfit into sculpted armor designed to exaggerate the appearance of muscularity. The character did not change biologically, but the visual standard sure did. Interestingly, this tension between realism and exaggeration did not begin with modern movies or action figures. You can see similar shifts if you look much further back in history, particularly in ancient sculpture. I remember noticing this very clearly while traveling and visiting museums that displayed classical sculptures. The figures are athletic and clearly strong, yet they are not extreme. The bodies look balanced and proportionate, more like a well trained athlete than modern bodybuilders, and the goal seems to be harmony and proportion rather than maximum muscularity. Later Roman sculptors approached the human body a little differently because many statues of emperors or heroes portrayed them with idealized physiques, even when the real individuals likely looked nothing like that. In those works, the body was not just an observation of reality, but a projection of authority and power. Strength was no longer simply something to observe in an athlete, it became something to project. That shift feels surprisingly familiar today. Modern superheroes operate in a very similar visual language where the body becomes a symbol of power, capability, and moral authority, and the muscles are exaggerated accordingly. The difference is that the exaggeration has continued to escalate. You can see this escalation very clearly if you look at children's toys. Consider G.I. Joe. The original G.I. Joe action figure from the 1960s, if scaled to human size, would have had fairly ordinary proportions for an adult male. Over time, however, those proportions began to change. By the 1990s, later versions of the toy had dramatically larger muscles, and some estimates suggest that if those proportions were scaled to a real human body, they would exceed the dimensions of even elite professional bodybuilders. The toy didn't change because human biology changed, it changed because cultural expectations about what strength looks like had shifted. Something similar happened with Barbie, but in a different direction. Over time, Barbie became increasingly thin with proportions that would be physically difficult for a real person to maintain. If scaled to human size, some versions would have had waist measurements that would make normal internal organ placement nearly impossible. The pattern becomes hard to ignore. Male characters become more muscular, female characters become thinner, and both sets of bodies move farther away from what real humans actually look like. None of this happened overnight. It developed gradually as photography improved, lighting techniques changed, digital editing became more common, and social media allowed highly curated images of bodies to circulate constantly. The result is that modern culture now presents a visual baseline that would have looked unusual just a few generations ago. When people encounter those images every day, the brain begins adjusting its expectations so that a body that would have once have looked strong and healthy begins to look merely average, while a body that once would have looked extraordinary begins to look normal. That shift matters because human beings naturally compare themselves to the environment around them. If the visual environment becomes more extreme, the comparison becomes more difficult, and someone who is strong, active, and metabolically healthy may still feel as though they fall short simply because the reference point they're using is a very small and highly curated subset of human bodies. Understanding this shift doesn't require rejecting exercise or physical training because strength, mobility, and cardiovascular health remain among the most powerful predictors of long-term health. But what this means in practice depends a great deal on where someone is in life. For younger people, the pressure often shows up as a pursuit of visual perfection. Social media feeds are full of highly edited images and extremely trained physiques, so it becomes easy to assume that appearance is the primary signal of health. In that environment, the goal shifts towards aesthetics, lower body fat, more visible muscle, and a particular shape that photographs well. Later in life, however, the priorities often change because the question is no longer whether the body looks impressive under studio lighting, but whether it continues to function well in ordinary life. Can you move comfortably, carry groceries, climb stairs, travel, sleep well, and remain independent as the years pass? Those two goals, appearance and capability, are not always the same thing. Some of the training and discipline required to build an extraordinary physique can certainly improve health, yet the visual standard itself is often cosmetic. The body does not need to resemble a superhero or a fitness model in order to maintain strong bones, good metabolic health, and the ability to stay active for decades. That distinction matters because it reframes the comparison people make when they look in the mirror. Instead of asking whether their body resembles the images they see most often online, a more useful question might be whether the body is becoming more capable over time, whether they are gaining strength, maintaining mobility, preserving endurance, and protecting the systems that allow them to remain active later in life. When you look at health through that lens, the visual expectations surrounding us begin to feel less important. Cultural standards of the body will continue to evolve, and media will continue to exaggerate certain traits just as it has for centuries, from ancient statues to action figures to modern films and social media. Those images say a great deal about the stories a culture tells about strength and beauty, but they say much less about what the human body actually requires in order to function well over a lifetime. In the end, the question is simpler than it often appears. What does the body need in order to remain capable, resilient, and independent for as long as possible? The answer tends to look far more ordinary than the images we see most often because it usually involves consistent movement, reasonable nutrition, adequate sleep, and habits that allow the body to recover and adapt over time. Those things rarely produce the most dramatic photographs, but they are very often what sustain the body across the entire life. This is uncommonly remarkable. Thanks for listening.